Thank you for joining the GSU community for our acknowledgement and celebration of the life and service to our country by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. For many people in my generation, we often ask one another, what were you doing the day that MLK died? I would like to share my memory of that day. I was a very little girl during the late 1960s. Although I am a native Chicagoan, on April 4th, 1968, I happened to be visiting my maternal grandmother in Mississippi that spring. The town is approximately 2 hours from Memphis, Tennessee, where Dr. King was assassinated. I remember being outside playing with the neighbors' children. I am African American, but the neighbors and their children were white. I believe that hatred and violence are taught. And as children, we did not fear or dislike one another. We were friends who enjoyed playing tag, ring around the rosy, it, and other children's games. But that day, we were asked to come into the house well before dark. In fact, my grandmother locked all the doors, closed the blinds, and turned off all the lights. The television was the only electrical device playing. I wondered what we had done wrong, or what was wrong. She didn't explain. I now know that she was keeping us safe. We watched TV and saw what all of America watched: the panic, chaos, grief, dismay, and turmoil of a nation in mourning. I will never forget that day. More importantly, I can never forget the man who died on that day. But I want each of you to focus not only on his death and what it meant to you and America. I want you to know that MLK was just an ordinary man who led an extraordinary life. Why was he ordinary? He was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He later completed an undergraduate degree at Morehouse College in Atlanta and a bachelor's degree in divinity at Crozer Theological Seminary and a PhD from Boston University. He married Coretta Scott in 1953, and together they raised 4 children. And yet, he was an extraordinary man because he made decisions that changed the course of his life and American history. He was the leading voice and figure of a nonviolent movement and fight for social, political, and economic justice for Americans. I could go on, but I am sure you are aware of the civil rights movement and its importance. As I observe today's commemoration, I am also aware that American society today reminds me of that troubled past. And so I encourage everyone within the sound of my voice to make a decision, like Dr. King, to be intolerant of injustice, to uphold and honor the principles of freedom and equality, and to serve our country in your everyday lives by searching for that extraordinary example of being a source of healing, hope, peace, and restoration to our campus, community, and the country at large. Again, MLK was an ordinary man who led an extraordinary life because of the decisions he made to serve others. One way we can honor his life's work is to be extraordinary and choose to live a life that transforms the lives of others instead of taking lives. In closing, I want to thank Dr. Clay for inviting me to give remarks, and I want to sincerely appreciate our speaker, Dr. Peniel Joseph, for taking time to share his wisdom with us. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we must. Thank you all.
Dr. Paniel E. Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and he's a professor of history at the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a frequent national commentator on issues of anti racism, democracy, and civil rights. He has written several previous books on African American history, including The Sword and the Shield and Stokely, A Life. The Sword and the Shield was named as one of Time Magazine's 100 must read books of 2020. Dr. Joseph currently resides in Austin, Texas. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you, Sierra. Thank you, Dr. Clay, for the invitation to talk about MLK today. I'll start by saying, my background is as a scholar of African American history and social movements and Black political, intellectual, cultural history. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been one of the folks who I've studied for years. And this recent book, The Sword and the Shield, the Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., really gave me a chance, years, to focus on the work of Dr. King. And today, what I'd like to talk about is really Martin Luther King Jr., the search for the beloved community and the age of Black Lives Matter. Because I think Dr. King has been utilized in this year of plague, pandemic, and protest in ways that really distort his radical and revolutionary legacies. So we usually think of Dr. King as this almost this milquetoast figure, this plastic or paper saint who would have given us all, irrespective of our political beliefs, group hugs during these politically divisive times. And a lot of times this year, Dr. King was utilized as a weapon against Black Lives Matter protest and racial justice protest and George Floyd protest, that Dr. King would not have approved the violence. And certainly Dr. King was against violence, but Dr. King famously said that the urban rebellions of the 1960s were actually the language of the unheard. So what I'd like to talk to us about today is the revolutionary, the radical legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., what he actually did in his own time and how that continues to reverberate in our times, and really why, despite the holiday and despite the commemorations, we really rarely celebrate the radical king, the revolutionary king, because if we were to actually celebrate the radical king and the revolutionary king, we would be on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement. We would actually be on the side of movements to transform the criminal justice system, movements to abolish prisons, movements to end what Dr. King said was the triple evils facing humanity: militarism, racism, and materialism. So we'll start with the beginning. When we think about Martin Luther King Jr., born in Atlanta, Georgia, January 15th, 1929, King is a product of Sweet Auburn Avenue. His father, Martin Sr., presides over Ebenezer Baptist Church. King encounters racism, but he encounters racism from really the status of an upper middle class Black elite. He's going to attend Morehouse College at the age of 15, and Morehouse, one of the best schools then and now. He's going to go on to Crozier Theological Seminary, a racially integrated seminary. and he's going to get a PhD from Boston University. Along the way, in addition to Martin Sr. or Daddy King, King is going to be mentored by people like Benjamin Mays, the towering president of Morehouse, and all these really towering figures within the social gospel. King is a Christian, he's a preacher, he's influenced by Gandhian nonviolence, he's influenced by different intellectuals of the period, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, Gandhi. And in a lot of ways, when we think about the early Martin Luther King Jr., he's also reading social democratic texts. He's also reading Marx. He's reading these different theories of history that talk about class struggle, that talk about economic justice, that talk about racial justice as well. So when we think about the early King, even as intellectually he might be drawn to more radical theories of Black citizenship, he's going to publicly be much more interested in reform, ending racial segregation. Certainly as a 26-year-old minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, King becomes the spokesperson in 1955-56 of a Montgomery bus boycott that's really organized and led by Black women, Rosa Parks, Joanne Robinson, just a group of Black women who had been organizing against racial injustice for many, many years and utilize the opportunity to desegregate the Montgomery bus system to amplify their already pre-existing networks of activism. In this case, Dr. King becomes somebody who the movement transforms and shapes as much as he, or even more than he helped transform and shape the movement. So in a lot of ways, King becomes this public political mobilizer for pre-existing Black freedom struggles on the ground. What we're going to see with Dr. King is really this brilliant oratory and this brilliant language that he uses to speak truth to power and really argue for Black citizenship. I make the case in The Sword and the Shield as well. Dr. King really is our defense attorney as opposed to Malcolm X's prosecuting attorney. Dr. King is defending Black lives to white audiences, and he's also defending white souls to Black audiences. And what I mean by that is that he's telling white people and making the argument that Black people just want citizenship, they just want equity, they want justice, they want fairness, they don't want any violence, they don't want any kind of revenge or reckoning for what had occurred before. So we're thinking about the institutionalization of racial slavery and then a century of Jim Crow, anti-Black violence, the politics and practices of racial domination and white supremacy and racial terror. So King is making that case to white audiences. To Black audiences, he's making a case that the soul of America can be redeemed. The slogan of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is an organization that King creates with the help of Bayard Rustin and other activists in 1957, is to redeem the soul of America. And that's really, really interesting because King is always saying that Jim Crow segregation distorts American democracy, but it also deforms the souls of white folks, and he's not the only person who said that. When you think about the work of Langston Hughes, we think about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois talking about Reconstruction and Black Reconstruction, the public and psychological wages of whiteness. But King, in a very, very impactful way, he does this in Letter from Birmingham jail in 1963 as well, says that the politics of racial oppression take a toll on Black people, but they also take a psychic toll on white folks as well. And that's something we can talk about in Q&A, we can talk about in more depth. What's extraordinary about King is his notion of citizenship. Over time, and King is in the public sphere between 1955 and 1968, his notion of citizenship is going to go beyond just the elimination right, and the eradication of racial oppression. It's really going to mean uh, active, visible justice. And by that, King means not just voting rights, but he talks about a universal basic income for all Americans, for Black folks. He's talking about um, economic justice and guaranteed jobs. He says that every American has the right to decent housing. He talks about health care. So King's notion of justice is less about just ending racial oppression, but about more about what are the visible institutional manifestations of citizenship beyond the right to vote. And that's what we're going to see in the Poor People's Campaign in the 1960s. But when we think about Dr. King in the 1950s, he's making these pleas for citizenship in the late 1950s in the context of the civil rights movement's heroic period unfolding. And I call the period from 1954 really roughly to King's assassination in 1968. Sometimes you can end it with the Voting Rights Act in 65, the heroic period of the civil rights movement. And the reason why I call it that is that this is the period that starts with the Brown desegregation Supreme Court decision on May 17th, 1954, all the way to the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. But in between, you're going to have the murder of and the political lynching of Emmett Till, who's a 13-year-old Black boy, 14 years old from Chicago, who's going to be murdered by white supremacists. His body is going to be found in the Tallahatchie River with a 125-pound cotton gin fan belt tied around his neck. Of course, the 381-day bus boycott, Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, where King becomes this national representative and spokesperson, if not the actual true organizer of the movement, which is again, Black women alongside of veteran activists like Edgar E.D. Nixon, who was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. When we think about 1957, it's Little Rock Central High School and the crisis that requires the 101st Airborne to be sent to Little Rock to desegregate that public school. 1960 is going to be the start of the sit-in movement, and that's February 1st, 1960. And when we think about that sit-in movement, that is the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counter, which is now a civil rights museum, where 4 Black students from A&T, North Carolina A&T, are going to sit in at a lunch counter. And really those 4 are going to become over 50,000 students, led primarily by Blacks, but with some whites joining them in sympathy demonstrations all around the country in the spring of 1960. That's going to start the direct action movement. And on Easter weekend, 1960, at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, it's going to lead to the creation of the most important grassroots civil rights organization of the entire period is going to be SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We may know SNCC as the organization that Stokely Carmichael led, Kwame Ture, and Call for Black Power in '66, or as the organization that John Lewis led for many years, future congressman and the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC is going to do the deep work of democracy throughout the South. SNCC is going to be what Harry Belafonte calls the shock troops of democracy, who are going to places like Albany, Georgia, who are going to Southwest Arkansas, going to Mississippi, the Delta, going to Alabama and the buckle of the Black Belt to try to organize for not just voting rights, but for small d democracy, for not just racial integration, but for citizenship and dignity for Black folks in the South. So SNCC is going to be hugely important. 61 is going to be the Freedom Rides. Dr. King is going to have a role both in the Freedom Rides and SNCC because he's such an inspirational figure, but he's not going to be really an organizer. He's going to speak to students. Many students like John Lewis are going to be influenced by Dr. King. Others are going to be advising Dr. King, like Bayard Rustin and Reverend Jim Lawson are going to be advising King on the practical nuts and bolts application of nonviolent civil disobedience. But King is still going to be sort of buffeted by these different forces during the first part of that heroic period of the civil rights movement. 1962 is going to be the year that James Meredith desegregates Ole Miss. And there's going to be 3 days of rioting, white rioting, at the prospect of the University of Mississippi enrolling its first Black student. 1963, which we'll come back to, is going to be the year of Birmingham, Alabama. It's the year James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time is published. It's going to be the year of Medgar Evers's assassination, John Kennedy's civil rights speech, and the March on Washington and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and then finally Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd. And then 1964, we have Freedom Summer, where 3 civil rights workers are murdered, 2 white, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, and 1 African-American, James Chaney. And Freedom Summer is gonna be huge. This is gonna be over 1,000 students, a lot of largely white volunteers, but led by Black folks who go to Mississippi, throughout Mississippi, and create freedom schools, a free Southern theater, civics lessons, early voter registration lessons, although that's not going to work until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And the Freedom Summer is going to be this extraordinary moment in American history. And of course, those 3 workers are going to be found outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, in an earthen dam on August 4th of that year. But the Civil Rights Act is passed July 2nd of that year, which desegregates, or is going to lead to the desegregation of public accommodations in the US. Now, in 1965, we have the Selma to Montgomery March, which starts with Bloody Sunday. Congressman John Lewis, who's then chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is going to be beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Dr. King is going to lead another march on March 9th, but really stop for fear of really being brutalized by the police, and they call that the Tuesday turnaround. And then finally, Lyndon Johnson is going to really address a joint session of Congress on March 15th, where he says that voting rights have to happen. He talks about the violence in Selma that happened on Bloody Sunday on March 7th, when 500 peaceful demonstrators were brutalized by Alabama state troopers. And subsequent to President Johnson saying, "We shall overcome," Dr. King is going to lead the March 21st to March 25th, Selma to Montgomery march. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act is passed. And that's how we think of usually the heroic period of the civil rights movement. What I want to talk about now is really, how does King fit into these events? Well, we could start in 1963 and fast forward a little bit from the start of 55, 56, because 63 is when King starts to try to really shape events by no longer just reacting and responding to freedom rides and sit-ins, and really utilize SCLC and utilize his enormous mobilizing skills to help a local movement led by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's in Birmingham where Dr. King is going to be incarcerated and write his famous letter from Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he famously really criticizes white liberals and moderates for wanting a negative or unjust peace rather than a positive peace that's going to cause disruption of the status quo, right? And he says that the young people in Birmingham who are being arrested and brutalized are one day going to be remembered and regarded by the nation as heroes. And here's King's quote for bringing us all back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. So what King does in Birmingham is link the civil rights struggle in a very, very important way to the founders of American democracy. And he links the struggle for Black citizenship and what Malcolm X called the struggle for Black dignity as something that is central to the American democratic project and indeed something that's patriotic. So we think about King and the March on Washington. That March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech is a much more combative speech than we think of it as. I mean, he starts that speech by saying, and this is August 28th, 1963, and it's a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It's organized by A. Philip Randolph, and the chief organizer is Bayard Rustin, who is really one of the most extraordinary period of the time: radical, social democratic, Gandhiite, peace activist, openly queer, who a lot of times is demonized because he's gay, and is demonized by the huge homophobia, both within the civil rights movement and the larger movement of that period. But Rustin is the main organizer of the March on Washington. At that March on Washington, Dr. King starts by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. And in that speech, he says that we come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the great faults of opportunity in America are bankrupt. So that speech is an extraordinary 17-minute speech that we always remember only for the refrain or the peroration, I have a dream. But in that speech, King talks about racial slavery. He talks about the state of Alabama, a state filled with vicious racists. He says that the governors in the South, their lips are dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, basically the same kind of white supremacist rhetoric that led to the violence and the cataclysmic strife of the Civil War. So King is really moving really away from reform as early as 1963. Part of the reason he's moving away from reform has to do with both what's happening on the ground in 1963 is really on some levels the year that's most similar to this year, 2020, with these the pandemic, but really the Black Lives Matter protests, perhaps even more so than 1968. What King is also responding to is really the arrival of Malcolm X on the scene too. Malcolm X is going to be the biggest avatar for Black political power, for Black dignity, and the boldest critic of white supremacy. And we're going to see some convergence between Malcolm and Martin by 64 and 65, but King is responding to all of these. And so when we think about King and what King's political thought and practice are, over time, King becomes increasingly radicalized because he comes to a better understanding of the depth and breadth of anti-Black racism in the United States, of the power of white supremacy in the United States and globally. King had been to India, he had gone to Ghana. He spoke out against colonialism, he spoke out against imperialism, but it's really gonna take, as the 60s progress. In 1964, King is still on good terms with Lyndon Johnson and is interested in the war on poverty and the Great Society. It's only after 1965 and the Watts Rebellion. And Watts is the explosion that we see 5 days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, August 11th, 1965. And Watts is really, the roots of the Watts Rebellion are police brutality, racial terror, racial segregation, economic injustice in Los Angeles that is a result of the racial caste system that was produced by the system of slavery in the United States and continued to evolve, right? The 13th Amendment says that slavery ends except for those who are going to be branded criminals. It says that not involuntary servitude ends unless you're convicted of a crime. And what happens is that the status that Black people had as being enslaved becomes transferred to the status of being a criminal, right? Michelle Alexander calls this, of course, the new Jim Crow. And so what King starts to see, both because of the rhetoric of Malcolm X, Malcolm's assassinated February 21st, 1965, but also seeing, he visits Watts in August and he's trying to talk to people. People are both, some people are listening to him, some people are heckling him. He starts to see that there has to be a radical transformation of American society and American democracy, and really the entire world to achieve Black citizenship and dignity. And so in that sense, what we start to see with King starting in 1965, and then he is going to go to Chicago in 1966. He's going to live in a housing project in Chicago to really cast a spotlight on racial segregation and systemic institutional racism, the racist policies that force Black people into living in the worst, to experience the worst living conditions in the United States. What we're going to see is that King becomes a much more vocal and vociferous critic of white supremacy. Certainly, King's going to be alongside of Stokely Carmichael during the Meredith March in 1966, in June of 1966 in Mississippi. And that's the march on June 16th, where Stokely, who King knows and has been friends with, is going to unleash the term Black Power. And Black Power is the Black Lives Matter movement of its day, right? It's a movement that is preaching radical political, social, economic self-determination for Black people. And King is going to push back against any connotations that are connected to violence or anti-white sentiment, anti-white as individuals rather than anti-white supremacy. But King increasingly, as 1967 and 68 proceed, is really going to be a pillar of fire who's criticizing the depth and breadth of racism. He's going to come out against the Vietnam War on April 4th, 1967. And that speech at the Riverside Church is really the speech where King announces himself as a revolutionary. It's a speech against imperialism, racism, militarism. In that speech, Dr. King says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He says it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to try to transform American democracy. He says that Black and white soldiers can burn villages in Vietnam, but they can't live in the same neighborhood in the United States. So King really calls out the United States and American racism and imperialism and war and violence as both morally reprehensible and politically indefensible during the Riverside Church speech. And throughout 1967, when we think about the urban rebellions in Detroit and Newark, King is saying that these rebellions, what journalists are calling riots, what the government calls civil disturbances, these rebellions are the language of the unheard. King starts to say, Black is beautiful and it's so beautiful to be Black, really echoing the language of Malcolm X. He says that the halls of American Congress are running wild with racism. In 1967, before the American Psychological Association, King says that the biggest threat to peace in the United States is the chaos that white racism has unleashed on the entire country. This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is not the King we're used to. And that's why King's polling among whites went down in the late 1960s, because King always is committed to nonviolence, but he's a nonviolent revolutionary. He is saying he's going to utilize civil disobedience to end the status quo, to end a racial caste system that has privileged white life at the expense of Black people and Black humanity. So when we think about Martin Luther King Jr., we see that in 1966, 1967, 1968, King becomes this global revolutionary figure who's pushing back against political reforms and is talking about deep structural transformations that have to happen so that the United States can flourish and the whole world can survive and thrive together. King famously calls the world house, right? And he talks about all of us having sort of this mutual connectivity, what he calls a single garment of destiny, but the mutual way that we all have to live together in terms of humanity. So when we think about Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign is where King really tries to knit together a multiracial coalition with Black and Latinx and indigenous and whites and others, but he's still doing it through the particular lens and struggle of Black folks. So King is in Marks, Mississippi in 1968, shortly before his death, and he's in tears talking to poor Black folks in Marks, Mississippi who don't have blankets, who don't have children with no shoes, folks who are going hungry. And just like right now in the United States, we have 37 million people who go without food every day. And King, and this is really extraordinary, when he's talking to them, he tells them that the way they're living is a crime. And Malcolm X had used the same language as Black America's prosecuting attorney, really charging white America with a series of crimes against Black humanity throughout Malcolm's public career between 1952 and 1965. And so Dr. King starts using the same language. And Dr. King starts telling folks that they're going to go to Washington and really occupy Washington. The Poor People's Campaign is the first Occupy movement in the United States. It's not Occupy Wall Street, it was Occupy Washington. And King is not going to Washington with a gun or a knife or even a curse word. He's saying poor people led by Black folks are going to stay in Washington until the government does the right thing, acknowledges their humanity, and makes sure everyone has a chance to live by having a guaranteed income. That's King's plan. And of course, King is going to be assassinated helping 1,100 sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, April 4th, 1968. But he wanted them to be connected to the Poor People's Campaign as well. So when we think about King in 1968, what's so extraordinary is that he's talking about racial slavery. He's talking about guaranteed income. He's talking about racism as a cancer and a sickness in American society. He's pushing back against those who criticize him. He says, they criticize me, but I didn't cause the illness. I'm just the doctor diagnosing the disease. That's what King says. And one of the last anecdotes I want to say about King is that he has this extraordinary talk with poor people in Mississippi in 68, where he gives them a history lesson. He says that in the 19th century, through the Homestead Act, immigrants and whites were given millions of acres of land for free by the government. And Black people who had been promised 40 acres and a mule, who had fought in the Civil War, but who had been betrayed because of a peace between and a peace among the whites, whether they were in the North and South, never got their 40 acres and a mule, yet whites got millions of acres of free land. And he says, these are the same people who today are telling you to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. And I always thought that was really extraordinary. And he says, now this is what we face. And so King understands the massive obstacles, because King starts to really unveil what James Baldwin called the lie, right? The big lie that you could subjugate Black people, you could have racial slavery, you could have Jim Crow, you could have white privilege and power in perpetuity, right? And with immunity and without acknowledging Black folks and Black suffering, because Black people were not human beings, right? That's the big lie that the country is premised on, both 1865 in the wake of the passage of the 13th Amendment, and then the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment right after Reconstruction, both in King's time, 1968, but also in our time. So what's so extraordinary about Dr. King is Dr. King starts to really, really push back against even some of the frameworks that he had accepted in the early part of his career. And those frameworks were frameworks of American exceptionalism, that the country was somehow innately good, that progress was sort of predestined, that things had to get better. King pushes back against that and says that the only way things can get better is not only does the nation must embrace Black citizenship and dignity, the nation must acknowledge the depth and breadth of racism, white supremacy, Black suffering, and Black trauma as well. So Martin Luther King Jr. really becomes one of the most extraordinary figures of the 20th century, and really one of the most extraordinary figures that the world has ever produced, because of his way of knitting together a much more panoramic understanding of the struggle for Black citizenship and dignity. And again, King is being shaped by the times as much as he's shaping the times. That's how history works. And really more so, you are shaped by your times than the reverse. When we think about the Poor People's Campaign and King's last speech, it's important for us that he talks about we have some difficult days ahead. He says that the greatness of America lies in the right to protest for right. But King also says that they have an injunction against marching. And in that last speech, he says that they're not in Birmingham, Alabama, they didn't let dogs and fire hoses turn them around, and they're not going to let any illegal injunction turn them around. So in that last speech, King pushes back against even structures of the law that are trying to uphold racial segregation, that are trying to uphold white supremacy on the technicality that this is somehow legal. So when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, the country had a real choice. It was at a crossroads. Either choose the beloved community that Dr. King had talked about. And remember, Dr. King said that that beloved community was one that was free of racism, injustice, inequality, violence, militarism, materialism, a beloved community that required a revolution of values for all Americans, but especially elected leaders and those who were in power. Or we could pick law and order. And law and order was a euphemism for anti-Black racism, for white supremacy, for the politics of punishment and demonization and dehumanization. And the country really picked law and order. So when we think about where we're at in this year of Black Lives Matter, this year of COVID-19 and the racial disparities connected to that, this year of the most divisive political election in American history, we really should think about Dr. King's legacy and really his revolutionary legacy. Dr. King would be marching in the streets alongside of protesters, certainly preaching nonviolence, but wanting us to find out the roots behind the discontent and the revolutions that we're seeing unfold right before our eyes. King testified before the Kerner Commission, the President's Riot Commission, the Urban Rebellion Commission in 1967, and he told them that the roots of what was happening in Newark, Detroit, Watts, and Harlem had everything to do with long-standing systems of racial injustice and racist policies and white supremacy. King told them that, and yet the country refused to listen. So we are at another crossroads in 2020. We have another choice to make, whether to choose that beloved community, whether to actively engage in a revolution of values, whether to finally achieve a different country, a country where Black life and Black citizenship and Black dignity are sacrosanct, both in word and deed, or we can continue to choose the road that has led us towards the fire this time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Joseph. We certainly enjoyed you. Before you go, we just have a few questions to ask. So thanks in advance. So question number one, many people believe we live in a post-racial society. However, there remains quite a bit of work to be done to guarantee that racial equality is achieved. Could you elaborate on where there are still gaps in racial equity and maybe say some strategies that can be used to achieve racial equality? And how can just the average person contribute to this cause, regardless of background?
Yeah, you know, when we think about racial inequality and how racism looks, racism is found in not just policies, but outcomes. So Black people in the United States are disproportionately overrepresented in all negative social economic indicators and disproportionately underrepresented in all positive. So One great example would be the criminal justice system and the disproportionate to our population number of Black folks who get arrested every year, who are in prison, who are on probation, on parole, but also just the supply chain of the criminal justice system means correctional authorities, both the private prisons, the exploitation of Black labor in prisons, but then just uh, there's 18,000 police departments, 800,000 law enforcement. The lack of representation there, not to say that that's going to be what transforms that system, but in all cases, we are being marginalized. Wealth and wealth building and wealth creation, venture capital, private equity, banks, corporate America, right? Wall Street. So those are all the places where our home ownership, our ability to create small businesses, even during the pandemic, Black businesses disproportionately did not get PPP loans. And so it's just been a same, age old story. I think the biggest thing that everyone can do is one, educate themselves about our story. Just because you're Black doesn't mean you know our story. You might have experienced being Black, but you have to really study this, learn about our history, both Black people, but the history of Black women and men in the United States and globally. But two, center and force whatever institution you're connected to, whether it's a PTA, whether it's a church, whether it's a higher education or K through 12, force and challenge them in their pedagogy, their curriculum, their public statements, but in word and deed to center not just racial justice and not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to center Black citizenship and dignity, and for all Black people, irrespective of whether folks are straight or queer, irrespective of whether they're trans, irrespective of whether they're able-bodied or non or neurodiverse, just the whole gamut, because that we are all of that. This is us, right? We have all those things. So we can do that, amplify the voices of Black folks, amplify the voices of Black women and men, in our own networks, but certainly institutionally and personally. So there's a lot of things that we can do besides being, yes, an active citizen, besides voting, but voting is just the tip of the spear in our day-to-day lives, in our churches, in our secular spaces, in our fraternities and sororities. It's about us centering racial justice, but centering Black dignity and citizenship and having deep empathy towards each other.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that, that if you're aware of someone else's story, you're more likely to not necessarily just relate to it, but take to heart their struggle, and then you'll be more likely to empathize and be willing to help. So thank you. So question number two, as you know, we are living in the digital era where some would say it's a bittersweet reality that's changed how college students and young adults are engaged or connected to these matters versus the days of old. So the question is, how can technology serve as a tool that encourages students to become more engaged in learning the history, becoming the hope, and addressing the happenings that will happen to them, to build a sense of pride and urgency in trailblazing paths towards a better world?
Yeah, I think it's already occurring. I think that we shouldn't just criticize technology. I think we know and we want equity within the context of technology building in Silicon Valley. But I think that whether we're talking about Black Twitter, and we can't demonize people where they are, right? So if somebody's right now just sort of interested in music, right? You're interested in hip hop, you're interested in sports, you say cool, and you say this whole Black consciousness, let's add that to it. Do you see what I'm saying? So what you don't do if you're trying to organize and get people inspired, you don't tell them that where they are is so negative. So it's not about negative. It's saying that I've got something positive to add to your life. That's what you're telling them. And certainly if they get deeper into politics and civic engagement, some of the things they're doing now, they may either braid that in, or they are going to leave some of the old things behind. The Bible tells us that, when I was a child, I played with childish things. And when I became, when you become a woman, a man, I leave those childish things behind. And that's what happens really to all of us. Doesn't mean we still can't have fun or a sense of play, a sense of pleasure, a sense of humor, right? Because anybody who's saying we want to build a new society, we all still want to laugh, don't we? I think we all still want to play a sport, listen to music. I know I do. So what we need to do is say, look, young people, where you're at is great, but we can add, and understanding this history is going to let you enjoy your life much more. And you're going to, and let them know that this is a responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, not a burden, to be Black, right? And to be, so we're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, we're talking about Angela Davis, but then look at all these activists, Tamika Mallory and No Name and Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and Brittany Packnett. So many different people, right? And so inviting them in, people are using social media to politicize and to gain consciousness and to spread education. And I think what we should be doing is saying, how can we amplify that and amplify a really positive use of social media? Because the old days are just the old days. They're important for us to study, but we're never going to get that period back. We're never going to get the period back where you could call somebody and there was a busy signal, and we marvel about call waiting. That's how, so that's great. I lived through those times, but these are the new days, and we have to utilize technology in the pursuit of justice.
Thank you so much. Again, completely agree that we have to meet people where they are. And again, you can't draw from an empty well, so you can't pull out of people what's not there. So the best strategy is to introduce things using the methods that are already being used by the young people. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Okay, and the last question is that we're looking at the experiences of Malcolm X and Dr. King, it's evident that their faith is very influential in the way that they strategize in the way that they did things. So what role does faith play today in addressing racial equity?
Yeah, I think faith plays a huge role. I think you see with Dr. King, his Christianity was so central to his life. Malcolm X, being a Muslim, both part of the Nation of Islam, and then when he takes the Hajj pilgrimage, he's a Muslim the whole time, is a huge central part of his life. I think faith-based movements are huge. I mean, the Black church is still one of the bedrocks of the Black community. I think the fact that Black Lives Matter is not necessarily coming out of the church, but many of the folks connected to the Black Lives Matter movement have been influenced by the church, right? So faith is hugely important. And I think those of us who are interested in racial justice should speak about our faith more, because I think we live in a world where the folks who've been most pronounced about their faith, unlike the 1960s, have been a lot of times folks who support the forces of racial reaction, and folks who support injustice against prisoners, against Black people, folks who are promoting war in the name of their vision and version of Christianity. I think the power of the Black church in the 1950s and 60s, and going back to the 19th century, was this faith-based vision that met people where they were, but was in support of justice, right? Love is what justice looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. The church and the Black church was preaching that, and so was Dr. King, and that's this idea of a revolution of values. So I think the Black church can still play a huge role, but I think at times the church has faltered in a number of things. One, the prosperity gospel, and this idea that we can all be millionaires, and using Christianity for that, the mega churches, but also just ceding the ground to this idea of Black citizenship and dignity to forces that are are not interested in that, but certainly are willing to wear their faith on their sleeve. So there is definitely a way forward, but that means the Black church embracing Black people in all their fullness and complexity. So that means embracing our LGBTQIA communities. It means embracing our communities of folks who are, neurodiverse and non-able-bodied. It means embracing the poor. One of the things that I admire so much about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is how much he embraced the least of these, right? King talks about going down the Jericho road. King really believes the word of the Bible, and he believes in the vision of Christ as a redeemer, as a savior, but as a savior who comes to bring not only the sword, but the shield as well, So it's important for us to know, and that's why I said before about, I think the best thing that Dr. King and Malcolm X had in common is the personal sincerity, the political integrity, and a deep, unapologetic love for the poorest, most marginalized, despised Black people on the planet. And they lived that, they walked that talk. So they didn't, when those people came up and wanted to hug, they didn't shirk. And Dr. King's in Alabama, Malcolm's in Harlem, and it's not the people with the suit and tie. They never shirked. They embraced, they ran to those people, right? Because again, that is us. That's who we are. And especially for those of us who are Christians, we have to proudly discuss that and proudly say we are that, in addition to be interested in addition to our interest in justice. And that's Dr. King at his best is a social gospel theologian. And the social gospel teaches us that we are put on this earth to transform it while we're living, even as if we do the right thing, we'll be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven after we are alive. But part of that entrance is predicated on what are we doing here on God's green earth. And I think Dr. King really walks that talk in a way that none of us will ever be able to live up to, but in a way that's truly inspirational.